Tell me about Harry Kane, your great-grandfather, and this mystery that really inspired you.
Yeah, well, as I say,
You told us about the mystery, but tell us about him.
Well, the bare facts I have are very few. I know when he went to Canada. I know that he stayed there until 1953, and then very, very briefly, after he sold his farm, he came back to England. And my grandmother, who was then a grandmother, she just got her first grandchild, far from saying, "Welcome back, Daddy," she really couldn't get rid of him fast enough.
Yeah.
And I've inherited all these letters. This is how this story came about. I have this amazing inheritance of letters and her diary and her journal. So I know the private thoughts that were behind the facts. So I know how she was feeling in the 50s when her father came back. And she, even in her private letters, she's very careful. You just get the sense that she is deeply, deeply uncomfortable and wants to get rid of him, which is not a very nice thing to feel. So she feels guilty about feeling that. And he went back to Canada and he died very shortly afterwards and died almost penniless. So it's a very, very sad story. So what I've done is to make up a kind of a, I hesitate to use the word gay because in that period they didn't have a word for it.
Right.
But for want of a better word, yes, I've given him a secret gay love story, which is why he had to leave because it was still profoundly illegal and he gets caught out. And when he's there, he falls in love, and that's terribly scary and tense because they're in a remote farming pioneer community where everyone knows what everyone else is doing.
Do you think the real Harry Kane was gay? Or is it just completely
well,
fictional?
it's a very good point. I have no proof, but the only two people left alive who knew him are my mother and my aunt, her sister. My mother now has Alzheimer's, so she's just read the first chapters over and over again and says, "Oh, darling, it's lovely," but she hasn't really taken it on board. My aunt, though, when she read the book, she said, "I think you might be onto something." She said, "I always had my suspicions." And then very sweetly she added, "After all, you're gay, and it must have come from somewhere." So maybe. But what I've tried to do in doing this very outrageous thing, making up a story about an ancestor, I've tried to position it so that it could sit believably alongside the facts. Because if it were true, my grandmother would never have been told. The women in the family would not have been told. It would have been kept from them. So it just makes the facts wobble a little, but I haven't actually displaced anything that's true.
Why explore this story now?
I think it was partly a compulsion. As I say, I inherited these letters, and then in the middle of them I found my grandmother's unfinished life story. And just the few pages describing her parents' marriage was so intensely evocative. And I loved my grandmother. She was a huge influence on me when I was little. And reading it brought back all the stories she told me about these aunts who raised her. And I have this wonderful photograph. It's on my website if anyone wants to look at it, showing Harry's sisters-in-law, this incredible family of, I think, 12 children.
Wow.
And I wanted to sort of bring those stories to life. And I also, part of me was just absolutely became obsessed with Harry. And the more I looked into it, the braver I think he was, even if you forget all the stuff I made up, to go from being this very comfortable, rich young man who had everything, to living like a pioneer, farming with his bare hands in the middle of nowhere. I mean, this is right in the heart of what became Saskatchewan, but then didn't even have a name. It was just, it hadn't yet been formed as a separate province. It was just the middle of Canada. And you went out on a little railway line. They laid these railway lines especially to colonize the area. And huge numbers of men took up this offer, because it was a great offer of free land. You had 160 acres if you could bring it under cultivation within 3 years, which sounds easy enough. But then you imagine you're doing this with an ox, if you're lucky, or a horse, and a plough. You're basically doing it by hand.
Jeez.
And then you look at the map and you realize each man was so far apart from his neighbor. They were incredibly isolated. And I think just to survive the isolation and then the cold, because of course they were completely unprepared. I looked at these posters that they used to recruit the homesteaders, and they show Canada with glorious sunshine, rolling fields of wheat virtually growing itself. The prairies, the prairies at this stage had not been cultivated. It was harsh prairie grass, which when men who wrote back to their families about the conditions out there, who described it, they said it was like ploughing wood. It was so slow and so hard. And many of them died. Many of them, the first winter they were there, they were quite unprepared. It went down to minus 35 degrees, minus 40. That's so cold that if you go outside and breathe deeply, your lungs will freeze. So Many of them died, or they got diseases, or they gave up. Harry survived, and he farmed all on his own. He remained all on his own right through to the 1950s. And I think whatever else you think about colonialism, and I happen to think how we behaved in Canada was appalling.
Yeah.
That's another bit of the conversation. You can't help but admire a man, his tenacity at changing his life to that extent and surviving, I think is amazing.